Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our PlanIt webinar. I'm Raya, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. If during this webinar you do have any questions, please post them using the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the webinar. Also attached to the control panel in the handout section, we have a couple of PDF files attached for your reference that they will be mentioned throughout the webinar. Feel free to download those and use them later. Today's webinar it's not just the color on the map, zoning in plan implementation. We are going to talk about how land use regulations and zoning fit within a broader implementation framework. Now, let me just introduce you to our presenters. Lisa Barajas.
Hi, everyone.
Is the local planning assistance manager at the Metropolitan Council, where she oversees a planning team in reviewing plans and providing technical assistance to local governments, advising the council's land use advisory committee, and collaborating with other governments on issues of regional importance. Mike Larson.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Is a senior planner and sector representative at the Metropolitan Council, working with 13 communities in Hennepin County, including Minneapolis. He also serves on the Technical Advisory Committee to the Transportation Advisory Board. With that, I'll turn it to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Raya. I'd like to go over what we're going to cover in today's webinar. First, we're going to cover what statute says about the relationship of official controls, including zoning, to a community's comprehensive plan. Next, we'll put a zoning into a broader context of plan implementation and the various ways that your community can influence the future. After that, we'll consider some specifics about zoning, thinking about some of the practical, legal, and political dimensions to updating your zoning ordinances. And we'll also include some hypothetical case studies to illustrate some approaches based on different situations in different types of communities across the region. In the Local Planning Handbook, you can find the minimum requirements for your implementation plan, including a capital improvement plan, description of the tools you will use to implement your plan, and the timing associated with them. In today's webinar, we will focus more on getting more out of your plan and not just the core requirements. This will help, we hope, to make your plan implementation through zoning easier for your community. And just as a reminder, while we'll be discussing zoning today, this webinar is not for law credit. This webinar will cover items that you should consider as you develop your local comprehensive plan, your implementation section, and updating ordinances to achieve your community's vision. You should always consult your legal counsel if you have specific legal questions. Minnesota statute says that the comprehensive plan shall provide guidelines for the timing and sequence of the adoption of official controls to ensure the planned, orderly, and staged development and redevelopment of the comprehensive plan. So let's break these statements down. In this webinar, we're talking about zoning specifically, which is an official control, and we know we're talking about the adoption of zoning. So let's focus on the guidelines for timing and sequencing. Guidelines for timing and sequencing mean when and in what order. You might find that some amount of change in your community is imminent. You might need to update your zoning sooner in order to address that change that is likely to occur very soon. Your plan can identify the risks, the opportunities, and the general needs for zoning changes as part of your implementation or land use sections. On the other hand, you might have a planning vision that is not well supported by current market conditions, or perhaps development or redevelopment is slow or not likely to occur for some time. Your plan can discuss regulatory changes that would occur in the future. That might mean keeping the door open to zoning changes, but not actively pursuing them in the short term. Perhaps you end up modifying your zoning code's list of uses or introducing new performance standards. For developing suburban areas, the staging of growth will affect when and where zoning changes are made to ensure that new growth is orderly and economically feasible. The opportunities and challenges you face and what kind of approach you take are part of a plan's guidelines for timing and sequencing. Again, the objective is to ensure planned, orderly, and staged development and redevelopment. Just as a reminder, the Metropolitan Council does not review or approve your ordinances and whether they are consistent with your plan. That is the responsibility of your local government. For informational purposes, statute does require you to submit a set of your official controls to us within 30 days after you have adopted them. And also as a reminder, statute requires you to update your ordinances within 9 months of adopting your comprehensive plan locally. Statute also says that when there is a conflict between the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinances, the zoning ordinance shall be brought into conformance with your plan. It also states that you cannot adopt an ordinance that is inconsistent with your plan. This section of statute goes on to say that for the purposes of this section, a fiscal device or official control shall not be considered to be in conflict with a local government unit's comprehensive plan or to permit an activity in conflict with metropolitan system plans if such fiscal device or official control is adopted to ensure the planned, orderly, and staged development of urbanization or redevelopment areas designated in the comprehensive plan. Your plan or follow-on zoning study may state that zoning changes are premature or will come when specific conditions are met in the future. In other words, your plan may call for a mixed-use development fronting a primary corridor in your community, for example. Your plan may call for specific conditions to be met to achieve that vision. Rezoning today might allow for piecemeal development that doesn't quite achieve your plan's vision. But when a project does come forward and meets those conditions that you've identified, such as perhaps site assembly, appropriate frontage, and meeting design guidelines, the rezoning can be coupled with the project approvals. The caution, of course, is to ensure that the pathway for projects to meet that vision is clear and understandable. I'm now going to turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'd like to now address some of the bigger and broader context of implementation, thinking about how zoning fits within that bigger puzzle. So as the screen suggests, we'll start with market demand. Undoubtedly, your community is probably considering the scope of change that may happen in your community. You probably have a sense of the demand for different types of uses of land and where there might be opportunities for future development or reinvestment. Maybe your community has done a market study. Maybe you've engaged a consultant about the potential redevelopment at particular sites in your community during your planning process. Some aspects of your plan might be more realistic than others. In one instance, your plan might reflect a strong demand for development that your city wants and desires and is less controversial. Maybe you have recent experience with projects that your community has supported. The plan might set a few expectations about how that continued development will be shaped or guided. On the other end of things, maybe you have demand for uses in your community that are not consistent with where your community wants to go. Your plan might discourage these uses in some way, either from locating or expanding in certain parts of your community. Each of these scenarios lay the policy groundwork for zoning decisions that may come later, depending on your community's circumstances. Another dimension of market demand is how it might express itself in your community. Maybe your vision is somewhat flexible. You may have some established uses, such as what's shown on the screen right now. Are you supportive of them? Are you going to try to limit or discourage them in some way? Or are they generally accepted for the time being? In another case, you might have specific influence over a site where the city has acquired the land, or a situation where a developer has engaged the city in particular about a site and wants to know ultimately what the city's support will be for the project. Public investments in programs also influence the market and market outcomes because the city becomes a direct partner. The city might have access to, say, pollution cleanup grants, use tax increment financing to support various improvements, or be engaged in planning for public infrastructure that could support plan implementation. It might be obvious for me to say that your plan involves the public. This includes residents, business owners, property owners, and public officials. As you know, successful plan implementation involves establishing buy-in and managing what might be different expectations among these groups. Orderly development and redevelopment relates to the timing and condition of change. For greenfield development in suburban areas, development may occur in staged areas as local sewer and other utilities are extended. In contrast, for redevelopment areas, change might only occur if and when some party can assemble land in a way that supports what is envisioned by the plan. You will have, through your planning process, a varying sense of the potential timing and locations of these opportunities. So, behind every real estate market are politics that can affect your policies, plans, and regulations. You are most likely involving existing property owners and businesses in developing your comp plan. As a result, you have a sense of how they may react to potential changes. A property or business owner's long-term plans may impact their support for your city's plan. The reverse is also true. The city's comp plan could impact their long-term business and property plans. Importantly, their political influence can impact how effectively you implement your plan, including any zoning changes. Again, this is not a law credit course, but we want to encourage you to consult your legal counsel about zoning changes. Even if you may be on solid legal ground, some parties, as part of the political process, may call into question the legality of what you might be proposing. Finally, your plan must have champions who will take risks, advocate for important steps in the plan's vision, and help create a positive expectation about what may occur in the future. These could be elected officials, staff, or people outside of City Hall. I'm not sure which those people on screen, which they fall into there, but if you are proposing zoning changes that are controversial, you want to ensure that you have support from planning commissioners and elected officials who will also be responding to the concerns of their constituents. And if you're lucky, support for your plan may come from people like you see on the screen. So let's talk now about some basics of the role of zoning in managing land use and development. On one hand, zoning can support existing uses and character in your community, such as established neighborhoods where there isn't support for a lot of change. In these areas, however, there may still be planning issues that arise during your comp plan process that present both opportunities and challenges for the community. They may be issues like home businesses, renovation of properties, tear downs, new parking challenges, gentrification, and many other issues that you can probably relate to. Your plan can discuss these issues generally with specifics left to a future zoning study. On the other hand, zoning can be used as part of helping to transform uses and character in your community. It can do this by limiting undesirable or obsolete uses and forms and supporting new uses and forms. Depending on your city's circumstances, locations, and likelihood of change, the city may be involved in a process of balancing both of these approaches. Now I'd like to talk about some fairly straightforward questions to pose to you about the potential needs for zoning change that come out of a planning process. First off, simple question is whether or not your zoning code allows the uses and building types that your plan now envisions. In some cases, without zoning changes, it may be difficult or impossible to implement your plan. As zoning issues and themes come up during your planning process, you could inventory them as needing attention and articulating that in the implementation section of the plan to be addressed in a future zoning study. A second question is whether or not your zoning will prevent or limit the uses and building types that are in conflict with your plan. You might want to consider how clear your plan is about what your community does not want. Maybe it's the scale of the uses rather than the particular uses itself. Perhaps it's the look and feel of buildings that's more critical to the community than what actually goes in them. So we're having some technical difficulties. I think we'll pause momentarily and get restarted.
Okay, try it now.
Right, should I backtrack some?
Maybe a little.
Yeah. Well, let me start with this slide again, and I'll kind of go briefly through it. The first zoning question for consideration is, does your zoning allow it? You may have a plan vision with new uses or building forms that are simply not possible in your code. So that's something to consider for articulating in your plan's implementation section that it's a need to be addressed in your future zoning study. Second question, another maybe obvious question is, can your zoning prevent it? Does your plan articulate what uses and building forms are inconsistent with your plan, and can the zoning address that in an appropriate way? So back to, I think, where I was transitioning, a third question is whether your zoning code is adaptive and flexible, in particular to take into account real-world conditions. One suggestion might be to run through some scenarios where there might be changes that changes for the better or that improve existing conditions, but maybe not quite what you had hoped for. Does your plan discuss situations like this, and how would you regulate it? Would you, through proposed zoning changes, would you be alienating potential long-term partners if your plans in your zoning are too restrictive or too prescriptive? How will you handle, say, the proposed expansion of non-conforming uses, non-conforming structures, or non-conforming characteristics of a site? Does your plan give you direction that you can in turn use to inform these zoning decisions that come later? Another condition is to consider, or question, is whether or not there is any other statutory direction, like those associated with historic regulations, zoning requirements for airports, zoning requirements related to the Mississippi River Critical Area, as promulgated by the Department of Natural Resources, and considerations related to the First Amendment. Other things to think about include Minnesota's prohibition on the amortization of non-conforming uses, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with, as well as case law related to regulatory takings. Again, an unusual but unlikely situation, but something to consider. Another final question to propose is whether other implementation pieces are or will be in place. For example, is there adequate infrastructure capacity for what's envisioned? Do you need right-of-way, for example? How would you, is that going to be identified in as a means of acquiring it articulated? Oh, now I'm turning over to Lisa.
Next, we'll discuss how to connect your plan to your zoning. After you've thought through all of those questions that Mike had indicated, is what is the approach that you should be putting in your comprehensive plan to make those connections? We've seen several ways that you can connect your plan to your zoning as part of developing your comprehensive plan. In some communities, your overall community change may be minimal, or you may have recently undertaken a broad zoning study or a rewrite recently. In cases like these, we've seen communities reference applicable zoning districts for each of their future land use districts just directly in their plan. This was part of their consistency determination. Did their zoning line up with their land use categories? Sometimes it was in the text of the land use district itself in its description, or in a table format like the one you see on the screen. In many cases, there was a many-to-one relationship where several zoning districts could be applied to carry out the intent of the future land use district described in the comprehensive plan. The risk to this approach, of course, is that your code references may become out of date if your community ends up changing your plan later, whether that's changes to the land use categories themselves or changes in your zoning districts that come at a later date. This approach may not be best for a community that is facing a large scale of change, however, whether community-wide or in a specific area like a downtown or a station area, or if your community has not updated its zoning code in quite some time. In these cases, your plan might be better suited to identify those zoning needs separately as part of your comprehensive plan. It may be that a new zoning district is needed to support the vision for your downtown area, like you see on your screen. Or that after undertaking a new small area plan, that there are specific zoning changes needed to fully implement that plan. Both your land use section and your implementation section of your comprehensive plan are both great places to identify those work plan needs. In your implementation plan, you might also identify the timing for undertaking a new zoning study or for creating that new zoning district. It may be needed in the short term, or it may be something that your staff or your community works on over several years that's more of a long-term need. You should also identify any other additional work plan items needed to update your zoning.
So I want to mention a few different approaches to zoning that can perhaps offer a range of flexibility and or different proved planning outcomes. A planned unit development, and as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a common approach in managing approval for large development projects, especially those involving more detailed master planning in greenfield areas, or perhaps large redevelopment projects on unusual sites. PUDs can offer flexibility by substituting or varying ordinary regulatory standards in exchange for overall project performance. They can be associated with an underlying base zoning with varying degrees of flexibility offered by the PUD process. One criticism that I'd like to cover is that they can sometimes be perceived as offering too much flexibility or uncertainty. This is usually in the absence of prior detailed planning. However, if your comp plan has considered these areas in detail, because of the opportunities and challenges that they might present, a PUD process might be the way to go. Another innovation in zoning is form-based codes. Most, if not all of you, have probably heard of form-based codes. One common misconception about form-based codes is that they are less concerned with use. Form-based codes, however, simply place greater emphasis on building form than is ordinarily the case. Form-based codes also put greater consideration on the relationship of buildings and site elements to the public realm. Oftentimes, I believe it is the form, feel, or design of buildings rather than use per se that causes the greatest concern. Many communities are starting to introduce more form elements into their traditional codes, even if they don't undertake a full-scale revision along the lines of a new form-based code. The other thing I want to mention is that some communities, I'll call out Plymouth, for example, conducts a periodic informal review of their zoning code. They learn from experience, maybe monitoring changes in the market and demand for uses, and it might be worth exploring for your community that if a continual improvement process for your zoning might improve certainty and outcomes related to implementing your comprehensive plan.
As you're identifying changes that need to be made to your zoning, you should also be aware of those statute and rules that are specific to zoning, as Mike had mentioned earlier in this presentation. There may also be special planning situations that affect your community's approach to zoning. For communities that are within the Mississippi River corridor, you may already be aware that the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources has updated the rules governing the corridor. This impacts requirements both in your comprehensive plan as well as changes in your local zoning ordinances. You can find additional information regarding those zoning requirements on the DNR's website. We have included that link to their frequently asked questions as a part of this webinar that you'll see later. If your community is near any of the regional airports, you will need to incorporate the airport zoning requirements if your ordinance currently doesn't already. These include airspace and noise considerations and limits on specific uses within certain distances of the airport runways. Your community may have participated in a joint zoning board to update zoning requirements around the airport. You can find additional plan guidance in Appendix L of the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan that can be helpful in informing your comprehensive plan as well as some of those zoning updates. You should also be aware that MnDOT Aeronautics is in the process of updating the state airport zoning rules. These changes could affect your community's land use planning efforts in and around airports. Once these rules have been adopted by the state legislature, we will update the local planning handbook so you know how these changes will affect your community. Currently, the changes are expected to be available sometime in early 2018. You can find additional information or follow the process on the MnDOT Aeronautics website, and we'll also include a link later in this presentation for your use. As part of your plan, you are required to have specific actions connecting your identified housing need to the tools that your community will use to facilitate the development of affordable housing in your community. You will recall that there is a requirement to identify the timing and sequencing of the use of those tools, which does include zoning, in the near term for this next decade. We have also developed a fact sheet on zoning considerations that you could investigate to facilitate the development of affordable housing in your community. We've included this fact sheet as one of the handouts with today's webinar. If you're interested in learning more, please go to the PlanIt page and look for past webinars on this very topic.
Now we're going to look at some hypothetical examples where the community has undergone planning and is considering implementation steps. So the first of our few cases is a redevelopment example in an area with market demand for change, but also some challenges related to existing use. In this particular case, the city actively supports the redevelopment of an area that includes obsolete industrial uses. They envision a new mixed-use district with housing and neighborhood-scale retail. The city recognizes that wholesale change is unlikely to happen, and they want to continue to support existing businesses and jobs. The city wants to introduce some limits on the expansion of more general industrial uses, even though there's probably a small chance of that happening. The plan supports the adaptation of existing spaces into new light industrial development, as well as, quote, maker spaces, unquote. These are uses that the city has concluded have lesser overall negative impacts in terms of traffic, noise, and emissions. They could be considered as part of this, quote, urban and industrial mix. In case number one, there are a number of different components to plan implementation. First, the city has acquired a tax forfeited property. The city thinks that it can leverage a redevelopment that helps catalyze further development in the district. The city has scheduled a complete street reconstruction along a key corridor for the year 2019. The city has also developed design guidelines for the district. This document is used to communicate with existing property owners and prospective developers about preferences and expectations about the design and character of future development, as well as planned improvements to existing development. The city has created a redevelopment district, which allows it to use tax increment financing, acquire further property, and issue loans and grants. And finally, the city plans a zoning study for the area. It will use the market study and the design guidelines document to help consider changes to zoning text and district designations. Now, let's take a look at some of the considerations, approaches that the city, in this case, might take with regard to zoning. All of these decisions are rooted in the policy and vision established in the comprehensive plan. First of all, the city recognizes that the zoning code's use table does not reflect new types of industry and employment. It does not want to discourage all business and industry, as we had mentioned, only ones that have the most negative impacts. The city refines its use table, for example, to include certain types of small-scale manufacturing that could be located in this mixed-use district. The city also introduces new improved site plans expectations. For example, this ensures that adaptation of industrial sites or new light industrial development support the urban design principles outlined for the district. The city also introduces new building form standards so that new multi-story residential and mixed-use buildings support the density, activity, and urban design envisioned for the district. Some properties are downzoned to match their existing use. For example, existing light industrial uses remain conforming, but the zoning change eliminates the chance that future uses would be more noxious or harmful to the surrounding uses. In a few cases, however, the city elects to rezone in case of creates some non-conforming uses. And in some cases, the city upzones property in ways that allow for new or more intensive uses that it determines are consistent with the comp plan's objectives. In our second case, we have a city with a corridor that is predominantly low-density retail, such as drugstores, fast food restaurants, big box stores, and gas stations. The city has explored possibility for housing on the corridor. Based on a market study, however, the city realizes that there's probably limited demand for market rate housing in the near future. The city, however, wants to support opportunities for workforce housing and affordable senior housing. It hopes that these developments could help catalyze opportunities for other housing development in the area. The city's plan states that senior housing would be ideal in particular locations near City Hall, a library, and park. The plan expresses support in a more general way for housing and mixed-use projects along the entire corridor. The plan articulates the characteristics of outcomes it hopes to achieve without identifying particular sites. 5 of the 9 blocks along the corridor are newly guided as mixed use, while the remainder of the corridor is guided as commercial. Finally, the street along the corridor had been in disrepair, but a recent reconstruction project has improved the corridor's appearance and function. As part of implementation of plans for the corridor, the city has identified 3 important elements. The roadway reconstructed included basic streetscape elements. However, the city plans additional improvements to streetscape in certain targeted locations. They have also developed guidelines for private properties to coordinate their own on-site improvements. The city also wants to support existing businesses by providing a matching grant program to improve building facades. And third, the city undertakes a zoning study. So as part of the zoning study, the city wanted to address the fact that housing was not currently allowed along the corridor. The city created a new mixed-use district that allowed either multifamily housing, commercial uses, or mixed project with both housing and commercial. The city identified parcels near the city hall one of which it had acquired, and one where an adjoining property owner expressed interest in selling. 2 other properties at the same corner had sites that were large enough to potentially accommodate a mixed residential and commercial project. The city elected to rezone these 4 properties to the new mixed-use zoning. The city also tweaked regulations for one of the existing commercial zoning districts that is used along the corridor. It had the effect of restricting further big box development by limiting the size of new individual retail uses to 20,000 square feet or less. And as part of the presentations and findings of the zoning study, the city reiterated the comprehensive plan's broader support for housing on the corridor, and that the city would consider future rezoning to support additional housing development. However, the zoning study concluded that additional rezoning was premature, given various site conditions and characteristics along much of the corridor. Many properties did not have the frontage, configuration, or access to accommodate the character of development that the comprehensive plan articulates. In this case, the timing and sequencing of change through redevelopment were important considerations for the city.
In our last case study, let's explore an issue in a developing edge suburban community. This community has both an urbanized area with existing wastewater services and a large rural portion with agricultural uses and some scattered large lot residential uses. This community has staged growth areas based on the planned extension of wastewater services to support new forecasted household growth. In its comprehensive plan, the city identified its goal to keep the rural portions of their community very low density until land is needed for the next stage of growth. This planning helps the city to ensure that new development is orderly and makes the most financial sense for the community. However, the city recognizes that there is some demand for new homes in the rural portions of their community. The city would also like to preserve significant natural resources and open space in these areas for future public use as their community grows. As part of their planning process, the city spent significant time in updating their natural resources inventory. An outcome of that work was the identification of priority areas for conservation. The city's plan includes several implementation strategies related to this area. First, their plan called for a utility extension feasibility study for determining appropriate post-2040 sewer service areas. In this feasibility study, they left the door open to considering refinements to the post-2040 service area, with the potential to bring some of that land in earlier if it made economical sense and the market demand was there to support it. They also coupled this feasibility study with their priority conservation areas and mapping of those to ensure that these 2 planning exercises were compatible with one another. Their plan also identified future park acquisition sites and called for master planning for all proposed new local parks. Several park acquisition sites that they identified were located in some of these future staged growth areas, and some were in the post-2040 sewer service area. And finally, their plan also called for conducting a zoning study. In this study, they investigated the range of options available to address that demand we talked about for housing in the rural portions of their community. Their approaches needed to be balanced with the other priorities in their plan. In their zoning study, the area in question was identified as best zoned for very low residential density in the short term. This will protect their existing agricultural uses and help to ensure enough space for private septic to be sustainable in the long term, and to avoid potential failure and requests to connect to the public sewer service before services were ready to be made available. As I mentioned, though, the city was open to considering how they might accommodate interim demand for rural housing development, but only under certain conditions. They determined to allow rezoning to higher densities of up to 8 units per 40 acres rather than their 1 per 40, in limited areas and only on a request basis. For this new rural limited zone, they also limited the uses to residential, so no commercial or industrial uses, and they established performance standards for natural resource preservation, public open space and trails, neighborhood design, and other measures that were important to them. In this new zoning district, they also established subdivision requirements. They required ghost platting in areas near parks identified for future acquisition. This would allow for smaller lots today, clustered near one another, with the remainder of the subdivision laid out to plat that future parkland and to connect a future street grid when it was ready to be built. They also determined that they could allow clustering or ghost platting in areas that were contiguous to the existing sewer serviced areas, but were not planned to have sewer service in the short term. This alternative ensures that urban services can be efficiently provided in the future. And then they encouraged clustering to preserve high-quality natural resources as separate parcels in other areas that had been identified in their plan for priority conservation of natural resources. We've included a handout on different methods of subdivision design as part of this webinar if you are interested in learning more about the different options that you might explore for rural development interim before sewer extension comes. So as we conclude, we would like you to consider the following key takeaways from today's webinar. Does your plan identify the principles or outcomes that your community is seeking to achieve? During what time frame is your vision likely to happen if it's known? And what part do regulations play in achieving your community's vision? Are regulatory changes appropriate now or only under certain conditions? Are those conditions clear, and are they connected to those principles and outcomes that you've identified in your comprehensive plan? And again, just a final reminder that the Metropolitan Council does not review or approve your ordinances and whether they are consistent with your plan. That is a responsibility of your local government. So I'm going to pass it off to Raya now.
Thank you, Lisa and Mike. I have a few things to mention before we move on to the questions. Here are the few links that were mentioned throughout the webinar. Both Lisa and Mike mentioned that. So that includes the local planning handbook, which has all the requirements for comprehensive planning included in it. In the PlanIt in the PlanIt page, you can find all the previous resources that we have provided, like the webinars that have happened in the past, but we have recordings of all of them there. There's also a link to the FAQ page that Lisa mentioned about the MERCA, so that's Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area considerations. And then, as well as the link to the MnDOT's Aeronautics Office for planning purposes. Okay, so with that, we have time to answer a few questions. If you haven't already submitted your questions, please feel free to do so. We still have a few minutes to get more questions. We've received a few so far. So I'm going to go into that. The first question is, what are the risks if we don't rezone to be consistent with our comprehensive plan?
That's a good question. You want to take that, Mike?
Definitely a good question. Sure, I could take that. So the risks if you don't rezone. Well, I think we have to consider what the the when and the why of this question. I think when you make your zoning, it should be, first of all, grounded in the comp plan, and then you should be explicit about why you might not be rezoning in terms of those principal, those connected actions that relate to implementation. And risk. Let's look at the question of risk. One risk might be that if you don't initiate zoning changes, you might not be effectively implementing your comp plan. One example is that maybe there's a market opportunity and the developer overlooks a site because it's not zoned properly. Or maybe they do due diligence and they know that a zoning change might be possible, but they feel like it's too risky because of fear over controversy over the rezoning and a protracted public involvement process. And thinking about legal risks, again, disclaimer, I'm not an attorney, but maybe a property owner proposes a project that they see as consistent with the comp plan, maybe the guiding land use, or maybe there's a description of what the future of an area might be, and it doesn't have the proper zoning. And so they propose a project that is more or less consistent with the spirit of the comp plan, and they request a rezoning, and that project is denied. Again, that has both questions about whether or not your community has support for your comprehensive plan, whether the comprehensive plan needs to be revised, and also if you deny a project that's not consistent with your plan, deny a rezoning for a project that consistent, you could potentially be legal risk in that regard. So we're trying to offer you general advice about the timing here. Again, we don't. Those decisions are sometimes somewhat subject to professional judgment. We don't. Again, we don't review those decisions, but certainly through webinars like this, trying to provide some context for helping you make those decisions. Anything you'd like to add, Lisa?
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. I think one other thing that we want to, one other risk that a community might have if they don't rezone is the potential for uses under their current zoning that might be allowable that aren't consistent with their vision in their comprehensive plan.
True. We had talked about non-conforming uses and how to handle non-conforming uses. While you may not make radical changes in your zoning, you could make changes that help mitigate changes that you don't want to see.
Right, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Now the next question is, if I do a zoning study and then make some mapping changes, do I have to amend my comp plan?
Well, I think the question is whether in making those changes to your zoning, if they continue to carry out that vision. So part of what your comprehensive plan should do is identify in those land use districts and in the overall subsections of your community, whether it's a neighborhood or your downtown or your station area, what your community's goals are for that particular area or that particular district. If your zoning study makes a determination that this is how you're going to carry it out, then you've made that determination on consistency. But if there is a change that is that you find in your zoning study that is a wholly different type of use altogether, let's say you had originally guided in your plan, say lower intensity industrial uses, but through your zoning study that you find that perhaps you should actually be doing some high density residential, those are incredibly different types of uses that would point to us and hopefully point to you that you should go back and make some amendments to your plan.
Yeah, I think a best practice is as soon as you realize that maybe there's a change of philosophy at the city level, more amenable to a use that wasn't envisioned in your plan, you should change your plan.
Right.
Do that concurrently or in advance of the zoning change.
Okay. Thank you. From your experience, how do you address fair housing and affordable housing dilemma planners always face, where they're doing comp planning and zoning, where the comp planning and zoning allows it, but the type of housing faces neighborhood opposition? Or in some cases, comp plan and zoning discourage certain types of housing or housing density in certain areas, which is against the federal fair housing law. How do you balance the law and local desires?
Well, I think there's two questions there we want to split out, and one is basically dealing with neighborhood opposition, and the other one is more to that second part, which is limiting of different housing types. Sorry, I feel like I'm going to sneeze. So the neighborhood opposition is more of almost a political question than a zoning question, and gets to some of the things that Mike was speaking of earlier. Do you have champions in your community? Do you have buy-in and support from your planning commissioners and your city council?
The best comp plans aren't going to eliminate controversy, but maybe they can help mitigate, identify champions, like you said, mitigate the negative opinions about these types of things.
Right, and then I don't know that there's a zoning silver bullet per se that's going to ever help with kind of solving the neighborhood opposition problem. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen there. That it will probably come up even where you do have strong support across all boards. No doubt there will be somebody who might make us think about it. So to the other piece, and Ryan, maybe you can remind me, the second question of that was related to balancing fair housing need, where particular zoning might have restricted at certain housing types. I think we want to, there's a level of specificity that can happen in your zoning that can sometimes be restrictive and limit affordability of certain housing types. One of the handouts that we included in today's webinar was about zoning considerations for affordable housing. So I'd really encourage the questioner to review those materials, because there's a whole bunch of things, including kind of parking requirements and setbacks, but also whether it's necessary, I think a consideration is whether it's necessary within your zoning ordinance to limit your zoning to only single family uses. Could duplexes with site form-based code and design actually still fit within that? Triplexes and quads. If the character of the neighborhood is still established and is still being carried out through a different use, is the density really that important? So I think that we'd encourage folks to consider zoning that allows for more flexibility within certain character types and not to get too trapped by very singular use type zones. I do want to point to Raya will talk about this in the future, but the council is working on some model fair housing policy that may be helpful in this context as well, that will be forthcoming later this year.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm curious whether the response to form-based codes has been favorable, both in terms of implementation and community economic development benefits.
Well, I guess I could take a stab at that. I did include form-based, a little bit of brief comments about form-based code in the presentation, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself to be a form-based code expert. I know that at any time, I do have one community in the region had been exploring a form-based code, and I think one of the challenges of form-based code is it does involve a new way of looking at zoning, and it requires, I think, more effort. Not to mention the fact that you might be, if you're starting your code from scratch, whatever you do, at any time you start from something from scratch, it's going to be a fair level of effort. In talking to a colleague during this process, they worked a lot with property owner stakeholders, and that time really, what I got from that conversation is that when the property understood the objectives that were outlined in the form-based code, they were a little different than what the property owner was planning, but they saw why the city would want to do it that way, and came on board. So I think one of the benefits of maybe doing a form-based code is that people have a little bit better expectation over outcomes that come out of zoning. But again, I'm not a form-based code expert. I encourage people to explore resources about that topic.
So next question, how should the zoning approach the issue of non-conforming uses?
Well, I think, again, your comprehensive plan should provide as much guidance as you can, especially where you expect areas that in your planning process you've identified that you're going to have some transformational change happening there, whether you've identified this specific to a opportunity redevelopment area or a specific redevelopment site or a combination of sites, or very broadly more of a downtown area or a corridor like Mike was talking about earlier. You'll know what's on the ground when you're developing that vision for the area. So as part of that planning process, you should think about how you transition from what's on the ground today to where you want to be in the future. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
Well, one thing I'm fond of saying is that you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Now, I mean, I appreciate the fact that you may have a very visions may be very visionary, but the reality is that you may be stuck with some uses for some time, or maybe those are really uses that that the community is fond of, but maybe they're not in a building that quite work. It's consistent with the form of buildings and new construction that you might want to see. I think a lot of communities will have taken kind of a middle ground so that improvements can be made in the short term, but that new redevelopment would be guided under or regulated under new code, new provisions.
Local government units must adopt official controls as described in their adopted comprehensive plan. I want to make sure I understand. Is it also a requirement to submit copies of the official controls to the council within 30 days after official controls are adopted?
Yes, that is a requirement in statute, that after you either adopt new controls or you're making amendments to your controls, that you send those to the council, Metropolitan Council. I do want to emphasize that those are purely for information purposes, that we're not reviewing or approving your ordinances. That actually what we often do with those is just double check to make sure there isn't anything in conflict with our metropolitan system plans, but it also gives us a sense of where folks are across the region and what they're using, whether they're using zoning or form-based codes, and how prolific it is, and helps give us a sense of what's working and that's what maybe not working, or new directions that communities may be taking.
Well, yeah, and although we're not charged with a specific role around reviewing those, it's certainly nice to be kept abreast about the kinds of changes that are being made. Working with my 13 communities, I hear about some of the zoning work that they're doing, and I can share that information with other communities about, oh, hey, so-and-so community is taking this approach, or has a new, transit-oriented development district, as in the case of Eden Prairie, or other communities that are working on areas that are have some higher expectations than they did in the past. So
yeah, it really helps us kind of connect other communities with one another where there might be some opportunities to learn from one another.
Great. Well, thank you. We actually have run out of time for questions, and I know that we didn't get to all the questions, but we will, when we post the materials for this webinar, we'll also include a Q&A document that will include answers to the questions that we didn't get to. And then at the same time, feel free to contact Lisa and Mike. Their contact information is on this page if you have any specific questions for them. So just a few logistics and upcoming events I'd like to mention. And we have 2 upcoming workshops planned in the month of December. The first one on December 1st, continuing the comprehensive plan conversation, is another workshop on community engagement, focused on what happens after the adoption of the comprehensive plan. The next workshop is on December 12th on planning for solar energy system in your community. Our last webinar in 2017 is on December 14th, when you can hear about a new model local fair housing policy and how it can be used in your community. This is the opportunity that Lisa mentioned earlier. Registration for all of these events are available on our website on the PlanIt page of the Local Planning Handbook. We will be posting a recorded version of this webinar as well as the Q&A document with additional questions that we didn't get to answer, and also a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. They will all be ready on our website within the next week. And then finally, as you're exiting this webinar, there is a short 5-question survey. Please take a minute answering those questions. Again, I apologize for our technical difficulties earlier through the webinar, but thank you for sticking with us. If you have any other questions or comments, please contact us. Thank you for joining us today.